Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, we will get started.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Zan. So it's a great pleasure to introduce a close colleague of mine, Zan Saeri, who is going to be talking about AI governance and what Australia's role is in that. So Zan has been an academic, he's a research fellow at Monash University just down the road, and he's worked applying behaviour science or psychology into everything from climate change and behaviour change in policy settings and trying to get things implemented at scale. And so Zan has also this year really led a lot of the initiatives around the EA community response to AI governance and the safe and responsible AI government solicitation process. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce Zan to talk to us about that today. Now, he has asked, rather than using swap card for questions, to try to make it more interactive, that if you do have any questions, either throughout or at the end, just put your hand up and yell, and we will he will repeat the question for the audience. So please welcome Zan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me today to talk about AI governance. What is Australia's role? My intention with this talk is to explore some ideas that I've been thinking about over the past year plus. And it's really not intended to be determinative, and a lot of the ideas here are somewhat speculative. And so I think that maybe the biggest thing to take away from this talk is that I think that there's a big opportunity in Australia and places like Australia to do important and impactful AI governance work. And I could be persuaded that that is completely wrong. So if you do have questions throughout, you can raise your hand. I might call on you, or if I'm on a flow, I might ignore you. But I'm trying to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions at the end of the session. So what is this talk about? So the idea of this talk really came from a lot of the work that I've been doing where I have been trying to figure out for myself, like, what are these risks from AI? Like, what are possible responses to it? What's my own fit with these issues? And so what I want to talk about today are risks from AI, especially catastrophic risks. I want to introduce some of the ideas that I've seen in AI safety and governance. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in Australia, and then touch on what I think Australia, as a nation, as governments, and Australians could be doing to address some of these. But there's a lot that I'm not going to cover in this talk. I'm not going to talk about the benefits and opportunities from AI. And I think that this is sometimes an omission that makes sense with this sort of audience, but it can sometimes be just like a very weird thing where a lot of like public discourse about AI is how do we balance the opportunities and the risks? Like polls are about, do you think in general AI will be net negative or net positive? And then in these sorts of spaces, we only ever seem to talk about the risks and talk about impact and likelihood, and don't really think about that. And I will continue that trend by not talking about that today. But I guess I just wanted to flag that. The other thing I'm not going to talk about are trade-offs between different approaches to AI safety. I'm just not well equipped to do that, and there's a lot of discussion about that elsewhere. And I'm not really going to give due credit to what I call current and pressing risks, which are the risks that we're already seeing and the harms we're already seeing emerging in current AI systems. So I'm not really going to talk about AI ethics. At the University of Melbourne, there's a Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, and they do a lot of work in this space. And I'm not really going to talk about current AI regulation. I think because I'm also very new to this space, and I think there's a lot more work to be done for me to feel confident talking about that. So you can expect from this talk an introduction to some of the risks from AI, some of the ideas around governance, what my view is of what's happening in Australia and what Australia and Australians could do. So let's first talk about some risks from AI. In classic academic fashion, let's first talk definitions. So in this talk, I want to focus on highly capable general purpose AI or artificial intelligence. There are many terms that are bandied around in the sort of AI safety discourse. Artificial general intelligence, frontier AI or frontier models, advanced AI, transformative AI. There's actually a very good article by Oliver Guest on the EA forum that explores some of these, and there's even a working paper for a scholar from Legal Priorities Project that sort of goes into this in more details that's on that as well. But the two elements here is that when I'm thinking about AI and some of the risks and the ways in which we might need to respond to those risks, I'm thinking about systems that can match or exceed ordinary human or expert human performance in some task, and also systems that have like a very broad range of capabilities, and that these capabilities can be adapted to a wide range of applications. So I would argue that the products that you see on the screen here, GPT-4, Anthropic's Claude, and Google Bard, are highly capable general purpose models, at least for some definition of highly capable and some definition of general purpose. But the fact that you can go to GPT-4 and you can get it to write a Python script to do data analysis and like help write a dissertation and get medical advice if you can jailbreak it properly. Like there's a lot that those can do, and their capability there is as good as talking to your dad or something, right? So on some benchmarks, these systems are already highly capable, and it's these sort of breadth of capabilities and the fact that these capabilities are emergent in some ways, we don't know exactly what's coming from them, that heighten the risks. So when we think then about some of the types of risks from AI, I very, clumsily would put them into three categories. The first are what I call current and pressing risks. These are the risks that I think AI ethics as a field are mostly concerned about. These are things like privacy, so from facial recognition that was implemented at Bunnings and Kmart, and then there was a public outcry, and then they were walked back. I will just make a note that Bunnings' slogan of a hammer with lowest prices at just the beginning in the context of AI is somewhat more ominous as a cast, perhaps, than they were expecting. So current and pressing risks are, privacy, racism, poor judgment by AI models trained on bad quality data, data leaks, sovereignty, things like that. Transition or intensification risks is what I call these current risks that kind of have gotten much worse because the models are more capable, the capabilities have become emergent and are maybe misused in different ways, or the performance is just getting better. So instead of a text message that is trying to scam you by saying that you've got a package to be picked up, it actually is able to effectively kind of convince you because its persuasion skill is much higher than it used to be. You also have this idea of transitions, which is we're in the world at the moment where we don't have highly capable general purpose AI in every single industry, and it's likely that we're moving to a world in which that is the case, and as we go along that transition, there are going to be many kinds of potential harms that might emerge, and the image here is the SAG-AFTRA, or the actors and writers strike in the United States, and one of the key ideas in that was a concern around artificial intelligence being used to kind of supplant the jobs and the work that those people are doing. And so that kind of also brings up this more general issue in terms of risks from AIs, which you could call kind of like a significant kind of change in what it really means to kind of operate in society, like the societal structures, and what dignity looks like and what meaning looks like as these technologies take more and more of what we typically think of as being useful or important actions. And then finally, we have catastrophic and extreme risks. I expect that you will have heard about this in other settings, but the idea of catastrophic and extreme risks are essentially risks that can lead to very widespread harm, harm that goes across borders, even harm that can curtail the potential sort of value of humanity, sometimes called a stable lock-in. And it could lead to extinction. And I think that we throw the word extinction around a little bit, but it's worth considering that extinction means literally every person on Earth dies. I tend to not go to to talk about extinction that much, but I think that sometimes when we say extinction, we're like, yeah, all of this stuff and also extinction. Now let's move on. But extinction means literally every person on Earth dying. So these are a very kind of clumsy categorization of different risks from AI. I want to talk primarily about catastrophic and existential risks in this talk, but I think that at the same time as we talk about these different categories, we can also think about there being different sources of risk, and these sources can then suggest different ways in which we might address them. So I want to briefly mention them. So we could think about them in three broad ways. The first is that any kind of system can be misused, so it can be used in a way that harms people by so-called bad actors, which is essentially kind of people that we disagree with or who have values that are different from ours. It could be that this economic and strategic advantage of AI can lead to kind of competition and conflict, so-called race dynamics, a race to the bottom, in which people pursue capabilities at the expense of safety, implement AI in systems or in critical kind of systems that it hasn't well been tested, or where those dangerous capabilities might emerge. And then it's also the case that AI could employ capabilities in ways that users don't want or need, or intend. And so this is the so-called alignment problem, which is when you try and use a system in order to achieve a certain outcome, perhaps the system just doesn't do what it is that you expect it to do. And this kind of goes into a lot of questions around more agentic systems that could persuade, deceive, manipulate, and evade human control. The reason I'm kind of talking about different categories of risk, like those pressing risks and transition risks and catastrophic risks, and then sources of risk differently or separately, is that I think that these issues in terms of sources of risk from AI are still present in the non-catastrophic kind of risk contexts. And I think that sometimes we do ourselves a disservice when we say these are only sources of catastrophic risk from AI. And it could be useful, kind of spoiling later in the talk, but it could be useful when we're thinking about talking about risk from AI to also consider, alignment issues not being just about, super intelligent alignment. And of course, if we think about, well, how likely are these risks or what's going on? Are these really a concern? There have been many expert assessments that have suggested that the catastrophic risk is a real concern and should be paid attention to. It should be acknowledged and it should be planned for, even if its uncertainty is low or even if its likelihood is low or uncertain. So Geoffrey Hinton, who led Google Brain for many years, he received one of the highest awards in sort of the technology space, called the Turing Award. He said, I'm saying fire and hoping that people listen, and has been quoted as saying that super intelligent or better than human AI is an existential threat. And then there was also a letter that was convened by the Centre for AI Safety with the phrase, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority. And this was signed by many scientists and public figures, including the heads of the three labs that created the products I showed you earlier. It's also the case that there's many other sorts of sources that are talking about this. But I suppose one frame that I would just put on all of this is taken directly from an excellent talk that Ben Garfinkel, who leads the Centre for AI Governance, he gave a talk at EAG London earlier this year. I think rather than talking about so-called P-doom, what's the probability of things going wrong, he wanted to talk about different scenarios. So he said that if there's a case where nothing we do matters because things are extremely likely to go badly, then we're in a kind of a shipwreck scenario, and maybe we shouldn't bother doing anything. But in the alternative case, maybe all of these risks are overblown. Really, the main issues are just ethics issues, or maximizing the economic output of these technologies. And that's the bumper scenario, right? No matter how you roll the bowling ball, it's going to kind of knock over some pins and everything will be fine. And in that case, there's no need for action on these catastrophic risks. But he argues, and I found this quite persuasive, that maybe it's worth considering that our action should be navigated by the idea that we're in a sort of tightrope scenario. So we're not on stable ground. We were on stable ground. We have to go out over a chasm. we could reach stable ground, and that stable ground is like a future with fully automated luxury space communism and AIs in every person's pocket. But we have to navigate a very kind of like tenuous path to get there. And by default, you can't just sort of stumble along a tightrope and expect to get to the other side. You have to take careful action in order to get there. So rather than talking about probabilities of risks, different kinds of risks or timelines or anything like that, I think about it more in terms of scenarios. And with low confidence, I say that I think that talking about things in terms of scenarios is also a more persuasive and accessible way to talk about these risks with people who are newer to the space, including people who are maybe making decisions about these things. So that's AI risk in a nutshell. I want to talk a little bit about AI safety and governance, and essentially a couple of the themes that are coming through in my readings around this work, and I'll emphasize that that's primarily the non-technical side of things. So we're talking more about the governance side. I think when I encountered AI safety and then AI governance and then AI policy and AI ethics and AI strategy and AI this, I just got so confused. Like, what's the relationship? Which came first? Like, what gets to be the one that calls itself most important and distributes money, and everyone else has to like follow their sort of decrees? And I don't think this is helped by the fact that there are all of these different organizations that have those words in their names, and in some cases kind of purport to be like, you should follow what we say. So you have the Centre for AI Safety, you have the Centre for Governance of AI. Here in Melbourne, we have the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, and of course, Greg Leeds' Good Ancestors Policy, who I've also worked with. And even if you look at the Swap Card app, you can't even choose an interest in AI governance. You can choose an interest in technical AI safety or AI strategy and policy. Yeah, I don't know why any of you are at this talk, because you couldn't be interested in this. So I'm actually going to sidestep this whole question and just talk about give a kind of very brief definition of these. So AI safety, I'm calling an umbrella term for work that tries to understand and address catastrophic risks from AI. And AI governance is how decisions are made about AI and what can help those decisions to be made well. So how decisions are made about what kinds of AI we should develop, what kinds of AI we should deploy, what kinds of processes we should put in place, and then also the question around like norms and laws, constraints, knowledge, things like that. So as I talk about AI governance in this case, I will mostly be talking about the policy, sort of the laws and sort of the norms side. But I also think that there's a very important role in kind of corporate governance or non-government governance, which would be things like norms and practices and standards that emerge in interactions between non-state actors. And I think that tends to be sort of under-considered in a lot of the general AI governance discourse, which is focused mostly on places like OpenAI. So it's not really thinking about like what Oracle would do, what Atlassian would do, what all these places that are not developing their own general purpose models would do. And so for an extremely abbreviated kind of tour of some of the different AI safety approaches, again, I've adapted this from Ben Garfinkel's talk. There are maybe three, again, clumsy categories that we could put activities that can reduce catastrophic risk from AI. One is around like just knowing how better, what the risks are like and how we might be able to make things safe. So this can be everything from like having increased understanding of AI risk in government or in public, which makes it more likely that people will take action to try and address that risk, through to what's called model evaluations, which is, and I will butcher this, but having a way of determining the likely safety of a model, perhaps before you start training it or before you release it. Better defenses. So if we assume that perhaps there are highly capable general purpose AI systems that could be misused or act in misaligned ways, then having countermeasures against those or being able to monitor a system to see if it might act in a way that you don't expect can be like a useful approach. and better constraints. These tend to be the ones that are more classically kind of governance based. So this could be like slowing down AI, prohibiting the use of certain kinds of chips by certain actors that you don't think are trustworthy. It could be about creating standards and norms for people to follow. Now, I've put an asterisk here because I think that there can be a false dichotomy or split between like what counts as a governance approach and what counts as a kind of technical approach. And I think in many cases, in order for a particular sort of approach or strategy to be successful, it needs both elements. So I'm just going to give a couple of very brief examples, specific examples here. So I'm not saying that these are like exceptionally good, and I'm not even saying that they're representative. They're just intended to illustrate. So one approach that's been put forward and has had a lot of traction within people working in kind of AI safety and governance research is this idea of what's called compute governance. So if you think about the kind of ingredients that you need in the pot to make the stew of an AI model like GPT-4, you need data, so the information that you've scraped from the web or books or scientific papers or YouTube transcripts or whatever. You need algorithms, so you need some way of transforming that data into a structure that will allow you to interact with it to get useful output. And then you need compute, which is the physical substrate, the chips, the systems that the algorithms like run the data through in order to build the model that you want. And one of the key advantages of compute, also you need people to like actually figure all of this stuff out. So talent is sometimes suggested as like a fourth limb of the AI triad. One of the kind of key advantages of compute is that only one person can use it at a time, which means that if I have it, you can't have it. And so if I think I'm safe, if I think I'm safe and I don't think this person is safe, then that's good because so long as I keep it for myself, then I can like protect it from being used by bad people. It's quantifiable, which means we can count how much people have. And it's necessary. You can't kind of create a model or even infer or use a model without compute. And so there are various sorts of strategies that might be used that could use these properties of the physical chips in order to get good outcomes. You could monitor like the usage of compute. Perhaps you put all of the systems in like some central space and then only allow access if people pass certain tests. You could restrict access, so you could like just ban the export of certain kinds of chips to a particular country or actor, or you could say, you can only use this if you sign off on using it in this way or pass some licensing test. And you could even reserve some of that and promote its use for other work. And so just in terms of like the technical side and the governance side, it's also important to consider that like this is kind of a constraint on usage. So it's like a governance sort of question, right? You might restrict it, you might create a law about it, but you need some sort of technical way of monitoring that and counting them and keeping track of that and figuring out like are people using it for a high risk or a low risk? So it requires some sort of evaluation idea. I'm going to skip model evals. And just talk about one other one, which is to slow or stop AI development. This is probably one of the purest governance approaches. It has less, I suppose, like technical requirements. Thanks. And so there's this idea that the global public is calling for a limited or an indefinite stop to AI development. Perhaps this is a voluntary pause by some of the leading organizations. Perhaps it's a legally enforced moratorium. So essentially governments say you can no longer train any models, and if we catch you doing it, then you'll be in big trouble. And the argument here is that it creates time to research or maybe implement these safer AI approaches, or build the laws and the norms and processes that are needed. At least it gives time for like reflection and consideration of what we might want to do next. And so again, like this can be considered to be like a way to try and address some of these catastrophic risks from AI. So far I've talked about, what is AI, what are some of the risks that are emerging, what are some of the kind of governance approaches that have been suggested in this space. And so now, in the last part of the talk, I'd like to talk a bit about what's happening in Australia and then what I think we could be doing. So in August 2020, there was some research done by Monash University that looked at Australians' attitudes around AI risk. And at that time, there was a question that was kind of like, what do you think is the existential risk or the extinction risk from AI, broadly speaking? And about 5% of Australians in 2020 said that AI could be extremely bad, possibly human extinction, if there was a high-level machine intelligence created. This year, the Campaign for AI Safety commissioned a poll, and that actually changed to 20%. Now, these questions are not identical, but the general sense is that there's an increasing concern about risks from AI. And in a more, less kind of catastrophic focused sense, there was also a study done by KPMG and the University of Queensland that was trying to understand, what are Australians' current comfort and willingness to engage with AI systems. And in general, it was very low. In fact, it was lower than the global average in most cases. So Australians tend to worry more about AI, the risks, and the sufficiency of regulation compared to other countries. So that's what Australians think, but what is Australia, if you like? What is sort of government narratives around this? So in 2021, under the previous government, there was a consultation and then a creation of a strategy called Australia's AI Action Plan. And it really was trying to figure out how to advance AI development and use in Australia. So the ideas that came out of that report were things like, how do we accelerate the development and adoption of AI in Australia? How do we make sure that people trust it more, because then they will use it more and then we'll get better sort of economic and social outcomes? And also, let's make sure that we manage kind of the risks, particularly the ethical kinds of risks from AI. That was the narrative that was being put forward in 2021. And in fact, during consultation in the discussion paper, there was this quote, which was kind of talking about how do you think about AI, and tell us what's kind of going on in AI. And as you kind of think about that, we should consider that we're still a very long way away from the general or super AI that can do all the things a human could do, general purpose, highly capable. Indeed, the development of such an AI may not even be possible. So very long way, may not even be possible in 2021 is the narrative that's being put forward. This year, the new government has also put forward a consultation around AI and is likely to use the responses from that, which were very wide-ranging, to figure out how it wants to regulate and act when it comes to AI in Australia. So you can see here the kind of premise of this question was, we want your views on how the Australian government can mitigate any potential risks from AI and support safe and responsible AI practices. They put safety in the name, which is nice. But the risks that came through in the discussion paper tended to still be focused on these so-called current and pressing risks. There was a little bit of consideration of these so-called transition risks, like unemployment and sort of the changing nature of work. But really they were focused on things like the misuse of AI for deepfakes and misinformation for sort of democracy. And it proposes a risk-based approach, which means if you use AI systems for safe things, you don't really need to do much. And if you use it for very risky things, then you need to tick a bunch of boxes, have it audited, get pre-approval, things like that. But the highest risk activities were things like self-driving cars and robot surgery. And the focus was really only on the use case, not on anything to do with the technology, not on the ability of the system itself or its opportunity for misalignment. And so in response to that consultation, there was a campaign that was organised by Good Ancestors Policy. You might have seen Greg talk about this if you attended his talk yesterday. And some of the highlights there was that was a public submission that was signed by experts. There were community workshops, and there were several detailed submissions from Australian AI safety aligned organisations. And in total, the submissions have just been released a couple of months later. In total, there are about 450 public submissions, and about 20% of these have mentioned catastrophic or existential risks. So that's great, right? Australians are worried about AI, as we saw from the polling data. The government kind of like historically hasn't really been that concerned about it or has framed the risks in a different way. There's been this consultation, 90 submissions mentioned catastrophic or existential risks in some ways. Many of the people in this room might have written a submission as part of the workshops or as part of an organization. So where are we at? Well, and to be fair, this is before this most recent consultation, but earlier this year, in the Generative AI report that was commissioned by Australia's chief scientist, one key question was, well, what are the opportunities and risks over the next 2, 5, and 10 years? And the response in the report was, well, it's too difficult to forecast, so we're not even going to talk about that. And in the context of this inquiry, after 100 submissions to the inquiry have mentioned catastrophic or emerging risks, there was a public meeting where the government said, okay, we want to hear your views in person. And one of the advisors to the Australian government said, after being asked repeatedly about catastrophic risks, that trying to plan for extreme risks from highly capable AI was like the Wright brothers trying to think about regulating a Mars colony. So, so far in the future, might not even happen, probably not even kind of like worth considering, let's not worry about it. So where are we then? Okay, there's obviously interest and consideration in Australia around risks from AI. There's some technical expertise. There's some policy and governance expertise. There seems to be public, change, right? Maybe not a majority of public are concerned, but we definitely think that there seems to be a change in time. So what does this suggest about what Australia and Australians can do? Epistemic status, highly speculative. I think maybe one way that's worth thinking about this is I've talked a bit about like these risks, right? These big catastrophic risks. I've then said, here are some like ways in which people could grapple with them, right? Do we need compute governance? Do we need ways to like regulate these labs? But none of those labs kind of exist in Australia. Maybe we're worried about like getting into a race where like, we'll race with another country or another actor and we'll like compromise on safety. But like that doesn't really seem to be a problem for us either. So maybe like we should just quit our jobs and move to the Bay Area and work there. I'm looking for David if he's in the audience. But I think like what's sometimes missing from this is actually there's like heaps of things that need to be done in AI governance that are like not these things that are to do with regulating AI labs that also have like relevance to catastrophic risks or emerging intensification risks. Right? Participating in international governance, addressing these current risks, navigating the transformative impacts, and then like planning and responding to the catastrophic harms. Because I think one thing is important to notice is that even if we are not in a position to develop highly capable general purpose AI, if there's misuse, accident, war, or misalignment, we are still in a position to be harmed by that sort of AI. And so it means that we still need, as a nation, as communities all around the world, to create like a response for that. You might have seen this figure from Crystal and Chelsea's excellent talk. It's also taken from a very good EA forum post that says why scale is overrated, the case for increasing EA policy efforts in smaller countries. Just in the very bottom right-hand corner, there's this idea of like an opportunity in smaller countries to learn and export, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a second. And so, part of the advantage of policy works in smaller countries is that it's generally easier to create influence, right? Being a big fish in a small pond. I think that is a theme that has been repeated a few times in the discussions this weekend. And this is also another slide taken directly from their talk from yesterday, which is that there are some suggestions that maybe Australia is like well positioned in this space. It's strategic sort of like location. It's having strong relationships with places that policy and activity is happening in these cases. We have relatively strong institutions and good research capacity. Maybe the refuge capacity is more relevant in a biorisk scenario, but like maybe AI like creates the biorisk and therefore we're still good as a refuge. So let me kind of talk about 4 kind of points, and these are also the points that we made in the Good Ancestors Policy submission. So Australia, and meaning the government, the nation, our institutions, big organisations, could acknowledge catastrophic risks. It could work with the global community. It could plan for catastrophic risks and respond to them. And it could also improve technical capacity. So I'll give you a little bit on each of those because I want to make sure there's a bit of time for us to discuss. So the Australian government could first acknowledge the risk, right? It could join the experts that have been signing these statements, the Prime Minister of the UK, who's called the AI Safety Summit, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who's repeatedly talked about this, all those 100 organizations that made submissions in the most recent round, and a growing proportion of the Australian public in acknowledging the catastrophic and existential risks from AI and committing to address these risks. And so one of the ways that it could do this is to participate in international governance, such as attending the UK AI Safety Summit later this year. It could be, when it's participating in kind of international norms and standard setting, it could be bringing AI safety issues and making sure those are represented and talked about in those spaces. And it could be participating in maybe experimenting with non-proliferation treaty negotiations. So questions about who gets the chips or who gets to use the systems, we could be an active player in that rather than saying, oh, we're not going to worry about that and then being subjected to whatever is decided without our input. And in this sort of general sense, as I made with Chelsea and Crystal's slides, we could lead by example on some of these cases. Small, well-run countries such as Australia can experiment with this, and the Australian government has publicly fought and extracted concessions from big tech in the past. We could also plan for catastrophic risks. So we could conduct an all-hazard national risk assessment, which we haven't done, which would identify, understand, and prioritize risks of national significance. And I think that, as is argued in this paper by Hunter from ANU, that if we were to do that, we potentially would capture these global catastrophic and existential risks. Because, as I said, even if we're not necessarily the source of these risks, we still have to assess and deal with those risks if they come to case. As I said before, we might need to consider when we're thinking about regulating AI, how we deal with more than just use and misuse. So include these sorts of capabilities and new kinds of risks. And then finally, we could improve technical capacity. And I'm grateful to some of the discussions I've had at the AI Safety Unconference about ideas in this space. So perhaps we could establish a program like was done in the US, where people who are advisors to government could get a kind of crash course or a boot camp in kind of technology issues, AI safety issues, and then they could take that back in and be a more expert advisor. We could establish a government-run AI safety lab to research and conduct evaluations. We could fund the work to leverage our world-class machine learning expertise at Australian universities that Ryan Kidd suggested. And the fact is that whether we're doing this from the government perspective or from a sort of business corporate perspective, our geographic location isn't necessarily a barrier to digital products and services, such as cybersecurity evaluations and other sorts of technical products that could be useful for AI safety. And whatever it is that we do in this space, it's also worth considering we should at least try to avoid making these things worse. So the baseline here is not necessarily that Australia doesn't really matter, so we can just ignore things, right? Well, in fact, you can see here Australia is still one of the highest per capita emitters of carbon emissions. The only ones higher than us are those incredibly tiny rich countries. In fact, there was a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, please stop developing new coal and gas if you are serious about getting to net zero in Australia. And so these acts, just as positive influence, international leadership for positive outcomes in AI safety could happen, this sort of negative leadership is also quite possible. So if we do nothing, then that gives an excuse for other countries to do nothing as well. And so I'd just like to finish by talking about what Australians could do. So I talked a little bit about the government, or sort of major actors. But what could people in this room do? What could some of the communities that we're building try and do? And I've had a lot of individual conversations with people over this weekend and group conversations. And I've been really heartened by hearing all of the ideas that people are bringing up. And I've stolen some of them into this space. And so I think at a very sort of high level, we could conduct sort of theoretical and policy relevant AI safety research. We could build capability in networks, so we could learn better ways of communicating this work, or actually just understand the issues better and try and translate them into an Australian context. We could develop policy proposals and advocate for them, as Good Ancestors Policy has been doing, and Policy Foundry has been doing. So just some specific opportunities to end with. I will say that these are not necessarily the best things to do. They may not even be like, net positive in expectation or actual impact, but they are ideas that I have had and I have talked about with people in some detail. And so if you're interested in finding out more about that, you can scan this, which I hope goes to the right place. I have had about 20 QR codes this weekend. Or go to EAGxAustralia.com/opportunities to read about it. And essentially what I'm looking for here is for these to be, I guess, like inspiration or triggers for other people to start projects and ideas in this space. And I think that if it's the case that each person can look for opportunities to do some research, build their capability, engage in policy development and advocacy, then we can build a really robust and growing community in Australia. And next year we'll have even more. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really keen to hear your input. Thanks. You had a slide about model evaluations, but you skipped over it. Could you talk more about that? So you asked about model evaluations and that I had a slide and I skipped over it. I would be happy to talk more about it, but it would just be like, here is what a model evaluation is. So I will do that now, but if you were wanting like my take on model evaluations, then tell me. Okay. Ryan, was a separate question or was connected to that? Yeah, okay, cool. So let me just grab that. This figure is taken from a paper that was led by Google DeepMind that had like, a laundry list of authors from Frontier AI Labs, Center for Governance of AI, and so on. And for such a kind of star-studded list, I think they could have created better figures in their paper. I didn't have time to kind of build a better one, but the essential idea of model evaluations is this. If you can detect or determine what the capabilities and the kind of alignment of a model is before you start training it, perhaps you can estimate that, you can predict that, you can model it in some way, then you could make an informed decision about whether you should even start training the model. And then you can verify after having trained the model, did we meet those predictions? And then assuming that the model was trained and determined to be safe at the time of training, before you deploy it, you can conduct a further risk assessment as to whether it's safe to deploy. And then as it's out in the field being used, you can monitor it while it's being used and detect any kind of like safety issues. But the key, I suppose, innovation or argument about this frame of the model evaluations that was put forward in this paper is that you can kind of wrap that in several layers of governance or sort of activities. For example, when you do that pre or post-training evaluation, you can also share access to the model or share the results of that evaluation with a trusted third-party researchers redacted in some way. And then they can verify that and feed it back to you. And then similarly, you can have a whole layer of governance around the security of like who gets to access under what conditions and so on. And so that's what the training, deployment, transparency, and security elements are. That's a super high level. I actually think the paper itself is very readable. I just wish that they had better figures. Thanks. Ryan.
Oh, so I know like that Australians seem pretty good at suing corporations for climate change damage in their future, right? Do you see like much potential for this with AI?
That's a great question for Greg Sadler, who is a lawyer in a previous life before he became CEO of Good Ancestors. Greg is very, so I try and represent his perspective here. He is very open to the idea of pursuing a discussion around liability for harms of these. And if I understand correctly, the idea is something like, if you purchase this model, So say you're Woolworths and you purchase the model, and then it's determined that like your customers are harmed by it, then like you could be liable for that harm, and in which case you would engage in some sort of negotiation with the open AI intermediary to make sure that like it was safe enough for your customers to use, or you could sue them, and then they would sue them, and then they would sue them, and so you would kind of leverage the existing ways in which liability is managed in order to address those issues. Yeah.
I mean, that seems interesting. Referring more to like, I can't remember the exact cases, but I think there's several Australian students who like sued, I don't know, like companies that they believe are like harming their future because of the risk of climate change affecting their ability to a prosperous future or something. And I'm like, well, AI X risk, if you interpret it this way. Sure, it's like very hypothetical in the way that
This is a good one. I mean, I'm very low confidence in this reaction. And sorry, just to repeat the question. So you're thinking, rather than sort of a chain of legal liability, you're thinking more about the idea of students suing polluters because those polluters are like curtailing their future under a climate scenario. So I suppose my low confidence sort of reaction to that is, I think that the public discourse in Australia is more supportive of there being future harms from climate change than there are future harms from AI. And until you have a kind of public sort of narrative around that, then it's almost like the pretext on which you were trying to say that there would be like harms, people might just not even agree that there were harms in the future. Yeah.
How do you think about balancing efforts towards, like when you're asking government for something, efforts towards something you really want but seems less feasible or something versus something more feasible that might be a good precedent or study?
Thanks, JJ. So the question was, what's the balance between asking for what you really want and asking for something that's like feasible and then might get you to what you want? And maybe just to kind of put words in your mouth, perhaps the trade-off is that if you ask for something feasible, then you've spent your energy or political capital and you might not get what you really want.
Or maybe even the other way around. That you're spending energy asking for something you really want, but it's wasted energy.
Right. So in general, it's kind of like, what are the trade-offs about asking for what you really want and what you want? That's some feasible version. It's a great question, and I just don't have a good answer. I mean, I feel like this is literally what I wrote in my swap card, how people can help me for EAG London, and no one gave me a good answer there anyway. So maybe ask me next year. I think I would look for ways to make incremental progress in the direction that we care about without making it like a solved issue. So for example, if it's something like, oh, we're really concerned about this AI safety thing, and we think a good first step would be to attend the safety summit, is maybe a more kind of like open sort of direction, rather than, oh, we care about this AI safety thing, and what you need to do is like change this one thing and then we'll go away. Yeah, but that's, again, I think, ask me again in a year. Yeah. Yes, thanks.
You touched on Australia's potential for maybe like offering services to labs and whatnot, be that registration or security or whatever. That seems like something that would appeal to a government in one way or another. Could you speak a little further to that? I don't think I've come across that idea much before.
Yes, I wish I could remember the source for this. I believe it might actually even have come up in a discussion at the AI Safety Conference. And I think the framing was that essentially, if we kind of take an expansive view of AI futures, and I think this is one of the benefits maybe of not taking a like, okay, everything is going to be terrible unless we solve things technically right now. But if we say like, we're going to be on a very rocky road, we're going to be on a tight road, then what will happen is that one scenario is that there will start to be cases of harms from highly capable general purpose systems that will lead to some sort of action by governments to say, okay, you companies need to do something about this. And then that will create a market for services and products that can manage that. Everything from like improving the cybersecurity of like systems that like frontier labs or like mid-tier labs, through to actually like securing the models in some sort of sense. It's all like work that I think needs to be done and doesn't have to happen in the Bay Area. But there are many considerations about like network effects and agglomeration effects and things like that. Yeah, I'm sorry that I can't speak more about like what that might look like or what direction that should go in. If I think more about it or if I come across the original source, I'll try and remember to share it. Towards the back, behind Michael Townsend, in the green jacket. Yep.
So we mentioned in response to Ryan's question that there is sort of more public awareness and buy-in around climate change than X risks associated with AI. Clearly that's not by accident, right? There's been a concerted effort to kind of bridge this gap between scientists and the general public to raise that base level awareness in civil society. Do you see something similar needing to happen around AI? Do you think we need buy-in from a broader section of society rather than just EAs and geeks, or not?
So again, I mean, I feel like that's almost the sort of question I wish someone would ask to the people who are super like focused on, okay, there needs to be like a technical solution and pivotal acts, because I agree with you. I think we need to have a broader coalition, and I guess I would say in a few different ways. Number one is like there are many people who care about risks from AI. Not all of those groups call themselves AI safety. And I think that like fighting or sort of dismissing kind of current and pressing risks from AI is extremely dangerous for a community that cares about kind of future risks from AI, because the narratives and discussions around like how those risks emerge and how they might be dealt with are likely to be determined primarily by how to address those current risks. So at a kind of community or like a movement perspective, I think it's very important to engage with in those coalitions. And that might involve us learning and changing some of our minds about how to approach these questions of AI safety. It's not just about them, waking up to issues of catastrophic risk. But in a kind of more general public sense, I think, yes, in general, there needs to be more public concern and awareness around like risks from AI. And I think one of the things that is very difficult in this space, and Marianne actually touched on this in her talk on Friday evening, is that in Marianne's context around the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, it's been 70-something years since a nuclear weapon was fired in anger. There's very few people alive today who remember sort of like those harms having happened. And so until some significant harm happens from AI, it's possible that the public support will still continue, public opinion and narrative will still continue to sort of treat it as somewhat speculative. And I would argue with a low confidence that a lot of the change in public perspectives on climate change has happened as we have begun to feel the effects in our daily lives, rather than being kind of convinced by the evidence finally after so many reports. Yeah. That's all we have time for? Yeah. Thanks.
So guys, thank you for engaging that discussion, and we thank Zan again for